Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into the most exclusive gene pool history ever produced, the royal family tree. Specifically, we're looking at what inbreeding did to royal children. If you think your family's Thanksgiving is awkward, imagine growing up in a castle where your dad is also your cousin, your uncle is your grandfather, and your bloodline is basically a high-stakes science experiment gone wrong. Before you drift off, take a second to like, subscribe, and comment, but only if you actually enjoy listening to stories about history's most questionable matchmaking decisions. Let me know where you're listening from. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan for that comforting white noise, and make yourself as cozy as possible. But let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to grow up as a royal, knowing you were genetically closer to your pet spaniel than to the rest of humanity? Was being a royal child all luxury? Or was it more like playing medieval Jenga with your DNA? Did anyone ever explain why your jaw looked like it was designed by Picasso? Or why your family physician had to invent new words for your symptoms? And how did these blue-blooded children actually spend their days? Did they have fun, or was every birthday party just a roll of the genetic dice? Would you have survived life as a Habsburg, a Bourbon, or a Spanish Infanta? Or would your biggest achievement be not turning into a medical footnote? And most importantly, could you keep a straight face at dinner while your father's beard and your mother's mustache started to look suspiciously similar? Congratulations, you've just woken up somewhere between the Renaissance and the 19th century. In a palace, stuffed with portraits of people who all look a little off. The servants are whispering, the doctors are panicking, and the family motto is, keep it in the family, but maybe don't tell the gene pool. Good luck. If you thought family reunions were confusing, try growing up where your ancestors were also your future in-laws. In royal Europe, the family tree is less a tree and more a shrub that's been aggressively trimmed with a bread knife. Marriages between cousins, uncles, and even nieces weren't just tolerated, they were tradition. Tonight, you'll wake up surrounded by portraits of relatives who all have the same nose. Good luck figuring out who's who at the dinner table. Let's set the scene. You blink awake beneath a velvet canopy, in a bedroom so full of oil paintings. You could play Find the Difference with your own gene pool and still lose. The air smells faintly of beeswax, dust, and maybe just a whiff of ancestral regret. Across from you, above the marble fireplace, hangs a family portrait where everyone's chin points due east, and every eyebrow is identical, a genetic relay race centuries in the making. You're not just waking up to another day of royal luxury. You're waking up to a logistical nightmare, because every time you introduce yourself at breakfast, you have to clarify whether you're Marie the niece or Marie the aunt, or possibly both. Your playmates are your siblings, your cousins, and your future marriage prospects. Talk about mixing business with pleasure. Family gossip isn't just about who ate the last macaron. It's about which branch of the family is still technically legal to marry. Let's talk about why this happened. For centuries, the main job of a royal family, aside from inventing new ways to wear fur, was to protect the throne. And the best way to do that was to keep power, land, and wealth in the family. This meant choosing spouses from within a tiny pool of suitable royals, usually other royals, preferably not French if you're Spanish, not Spanish if you're French, but always someone who could draw their family tree without lifting the pen. Forget romance. Courtship was a high-stakes version of Guess Who, where every answer is a relative. Imagine what family gatherings felt like. You're seated between your uncle, who's also your father-in-law, and your cousin, who might one day be your spouse, trying to keep track of who owes whom money and who's next in line for a throne, a duchy, or a mysterious, recurring skin rash. The conversation at dinner is less about the weather and more about which Habsburg is eligible for which Bourbon and whether anyone remembers where you put the marriage contract. Every toast is raised to family unity, and trust me, unity is not in short supply. The result? An endless parade of christenings, betrothals, and weddings, all featuring the same 10 faces and the same priest who's quietly working on his family therapy credentials. The palace is filled with gossip, alliances, and enough family drama to keep a soap opera running for centuries. But it's not all politics and power games. There's a bizarre sense of intimacy here, too. You know everyone. You know everyone's secrets. And everyone, unfortunately, knows yours. But it comes at a price. The family tree becomes so entangled that eventually nobody's really sure who's related to whom by blood, marriage, or accident. When the Habsburgs finally needed a new portrait painter, they didn't bother with realism, they just asked for the usual face. At this point, the best you can hope for is to avoid awkward pauses during introductions, or worse, attending a wedding where the bride and groom both call the same person grandma. So tonight, as you drift off surrounded by painted eyes that all seem to follow you with suspicious familiarity, take comfort in knowing you're part of the most exclusive club in Europe, one with a membership policy so strict you have to be born into it. But be careful. The next marriage proposal might come from someone who already shares your favorite childhood memory. Good luck untangling that family shrub. And don't be surprised if your family crest features not a mighty oak, but a very anxious, tightly looped vine. Let's talk about the world's most famous chin, the Habsburg jaw. You don't just inherit your father's title, you get his jawline too, and unfortunately, it's a jawline that could open cans. The infamous protruding mandible became the family brand, a souvenir from centuries of cousinly affection, and it showed up everywhere, from royal portraits to medical textbooks. Let's set the scene. You wake up in your silk pajamas and shuffle to the mirror. Instead of a gentle, noble profile, you find yourself gazing at a jaw so pronounced it could be used as a sundial. Congratulations, you're officially part of the Habsburg dynasty, where the family crest might as well have been two chins, rampant. While everyone else in Europe was worried about plague or the price of bread, the Habsburgs were locked in a fierce battle with their own lower faces. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism if you want to sound fancy at parties, was the most recognizable side effect of centuries of inbreeding, and it wasn't just a quirky little trait, like a widow's peak or unusually hairy elbows. No, this was a genetic calling card, one that showed up in everything from paintings to wax death masks, immortalized in marble, and even written about by the family's own doctors. If you ever wondered why old royal portraits often feature kings and queens staring nobly off to the left, now you know. It was probably the only angle that made the jaw look like a chin instead of a minor architectural project. And it wasn't just about appearance. The Habsburg jaw came with some serious baggage. Having a jaw that jutted out so far you could rest a tankard of ale on it might sound amusing, but for the people living with it, life wasn't so entertaining. Many Habsburgs struggled to eat, speak, or even close their mouths properly. Take Charles II of Spain, for example. The man could barely chew, and his speech was so garbled that palace interpreters became a necessary part of royal gatherings. It's like living every day with a mouthful of marbles. Except the marbles are your own teeth, and everyone expects you to deliver a speech at dinner. Now, you'd think that after a few generations, someone in the family would have said, maybe we should add a little genetic variety to the mix. But no, the royal solution was to double down. More cousins, more uncles. Someone fetch the family tree, preferably one without too many branches. This commitment to family tradition turned the Habsburg jaw into the medieval world's most unfortunate brand logo. It was on coins, in statues, and in those stiff, deeply unflattering portraits that must have made every artist long for an easier commission, like painting a horse or a particularly challenging vase. Imagine being a child in the Habsburg household. As you grow, family members keep giving you side-eye at dinner, waiting to see which features will blossom. Oh, look, he's got his mother's eyes. And his father's well. Let's just call it a jaw. Even outside the palace, everyone knew what a Habsburg looked like. If you stumbled into a tavern anywhere from Vienna to Madrid and asked, "Seen any royals lately?" the bartender would probably just stick out his chin and nod. Royal doctors tried their best to treat the condition, but medieval medicine being what it was, their options were limited. Some attempted odd mouth exercises, and a few even recommended strategically placed beards for the men. Others wrote long, apologetic letters to distant cousins suggesting new marriage candidates with delicate features, code for, "Please, let's skip the jaw this time." Of course, politics usually won over genetics, but there was a silver lining, if you can call it that. The Habsburg jaw became so famous that it turned into a symbol of dynastic power. It meant you belonged. It meant you were part of a ruling elite so exclusive, not even nature could stop you. The jaw became a conversation starter, a rallying point, and, let's be honest, probably a pretty good nutcracker during long council meetings. So tonight, as you drift off, spare a thought for the Habsburg children, who inherited more than just castles and crowns. They inherited a chin that could rule Europe and a dental bill that could fund a war. If you ever feel self-conscious about your own jawline, just remember, at least yours never made it into a history textbook. Sleep tight, and may your dreams be full of strong profiles and dental symmetry. Being royal isn't all diamonds and parties. Thanks to inbreeding, a lot of royal children found themselves wrestling with mood swings, mysterious illnesses, and a family doctor whose solution to everything was, "Have you tried more prayer and fewer cousins?" Depression, melancholia, and sudden fits were just as much a part of royal life as coronation robes. Let's set the mood. You wake up in a four-poster bed big enough to host a minor revolution, sunlight streaming through stained glass, and yet, despite all this opulence, you feel like the world is pressing down on your chest. Outside, servants scurry and bells ring, but inside, you're locked in a struggle that no velvet cushion or diamond brooch can fix. This isn't the life the fairy tales promised. Instead of a life filled with feasts and festivals, you're stuck in an emotional haze, with everyone around you hoping it's just a passing cloud and not another royal episode. The blue blood that filled royal veins didn't just carry claims to the throne, it sometimes delivered a heavy helping of anxiety, melancholy, and what 17th century court physicians politely called nervous distempers. If you think holiday dinners at your place are awkward, imagine what it's like in a castle where nobody wants to mention that the prince hasn't left his bedchamber in 3 weeks, or that the princess screams at the curtains because she's convinced they're plotting against her. In modern terms, we'd talk about anxiety, depression, or maybe a bit of therapy. In royal Europe, the solution was usually a combination of herbal tea, urgent prayer, and hoping your child would eventually snap out of it. But why were royal children so often at war with their own minds? The answer, as usual, comes back to the family tree. Inbreeding didn't just affect jaws and joints. It also increased the chances of inheriting certain mental health conditions, bipolar disorder, epilepsy, and forms of hereditary depression included. If your parents share more than a last name, there's a good chance your family portrait will include a few moody stares and more than one monarch with strange behaviors. Some royal children became famous for their melancholia, spending entire seasons lost in contemplation, neglecting state business, or composing poetry that would make even a romantic sigh with concern. Take, for instance, King George III of England, who spent his later years drifting in and out of lucidity, talking to trees and issuing orders to non-existent armies. Or Spain's Charles II, who mixed medical mysteries with frequent bouts of sadness so intense that his advisors wondered if the Habsburg jaw wasn't just physical, maybe it was emotional too. Even Queen Maria I of Portugal became known as Maria the Mad, her emotional storms so powerful the entire court tiptoed around her, hoping for a good day and bracing for the bad ones. What did the royal doctors recommend? Well, if you were feeling blue, you might be bled, cupped, or given a healthy serving of lettuce soup. Sometimes you'd be prescribed a trip to the countryside, where fresh air was considered the original antidepressant. Prayer was a favorite remedy. Perhaps kneeling for hours in a chilly chapel would convince God to send down some mental clarity. Failing that, the royal family might simply hide their troubled relatives away, shuttling them off to distant palaces or, in some cases, full-blown asylums. Nothing says love like a well-decorated tower room and a promise to write at Christmas. Despite all this, palace life carried on. Servants would whisper about delicate nerves, courtiers would invent excuses for absences, and royal children were expected to put on their best faces, at least for official portraits. You could be having a breakdown, but as long as your hair was powdered and you bowed at the right angle, most people just pretended everything was splendid. The pressure to perform, to appear noble at all times, only added to the emotional weight. So, as you drift into sleep, remember, being royal meant you were never truly alone, even when you desperately wished to be. Between the prayers, the potions, and the parade of worried physicians, royal children faced a lifetime of expectations, sometimes crushing, sometimes absurd. If you've ever had a bad day and just wanted to hide under the covers, take comfort. So did kings and queens. The only difference is they had to do it in a room with 20 servants, 3 portraits of their own face, and the faint suspicion that someone, somewhere, was blaming it all on the curtains. Sleep well, and may your only royal inheritance be the gift of a good night's rest. Charles II's doctors took one look at him and reached for the holy water. With a jaw so pronounced he couldn't chew, and a body so frail that standing up counted as cardio, Charles was the final boss of royal inbreeding. His medical records read like a warning label on a bottle of medieval medicine. Congratulations, you've just woken up as Charles II of Spain, the most scrutinized child in European history. The palace is abuzz, servants are whispering, physicians are frowning, and your parents are consulting every saint and herbalist in the kingdom. If you so much as sneeze, someone's making a note of it. Your daily life is less about royal privilege and more about surviving the gauntlet of medieval medicine, with a parade of doctors who seem to be guessing as they go. If you're hoping for privacy, forget it. Every cough, rash, and digestive mishap is front-page news at court. The Habsburg dynasty had been mixing its family branches for generations, but Charles II was where the gene pool finally ran out of lifeguards. Born in 1661, he was a living monument to centuries of cousin marriage. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his aunt and his cousin. Wrap your head around that one, if you dare. The results were not subtle. Charles was born with so many physical and mental challenges that royal doctors quickly ran out of euphemisms and started inventing new ones. Let's take a closer look. As a baby, Charles was so weak he couldn't even sit up without assistance. He didn't speak until he was 4 or walk until he was 8. His teeth, when they arrived, grew in at strange angles, and his infamous Habsburg jaw jutted out so far he couldn't fully close his mouth. Eating was a challenge, drinking was a risk, and talking required an audience that was very patient and very polite. His tongue was so large that even the best court flattery couldn't explain away his perpetual drooling. By royal standards, this was the stuff of nightmares. The list of ailments didn't stop at the jaw. Charles suffered from seizures, chronic infections, and what his doctors called fits of melancholy. His legs were weak, his hands trembled, and his vision was often blurred. He was described by visitors as childlike in mind, even as he grew into adulthood. One ambassador noted that Charles was short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. And if that isn't enough to make you want to crawl back under the royal covers, add in frequent digestive issues that made every meal a gamble. But the real medical mystery was that nobody in the palace had any idea what to do. Medicine in the 17th century was more of a choose-your-own-adventure novel than a science. Some doctors believed Charles was cursed, others blamed the alignment of the planets, and a few just shrugged and reached for the nearest jar of leeches. Remedies ranged from elaborate herbal concoctions to the always popular bloodletting, and sometimes just desperate prayers. None of it worked, but it did provide an endless parade of distractions for everyone involved. Meanwhile, the Spanish court tiptoed around the king's health as if it were a loaded cannon. Every time Charles sneezed, noble families started updating their wills, and foreign ambassadors sent urgent letters home. The fate of an empire depended on whether or not a 30-year-old king could eat soup without incident. You'd think all this royal attention might have helped, but in truth, it just made Charles's life more stressful. He was surrounded by anxious advisors, political schemers, and a family that mostly hoped for a miracle. Any miracle would do. Despite it all, Charles lived to the age of 38, a genuine medical marvel considering his situation. His reign was marked by instability, endless intrigue, and the looming question of who would inherit the Spanish throne after him. When he died in 1700, childless and exhausted, his autopsy became a legendary piece of palace gossip. The doctors declared that Charles had no blood, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and a single testicle as black as coal. If you're wondering how much of that is true and how much is poetic exaggeration, well, that's royal history for you. So tonight, as you settle in, be grateful that your family tree includes a few strangers, your doctor washes his hands, and your biggest medical mystery is whether you snore. For Charles II, every day was a battle against his own body and against the wild guesses of early modern medicine. Sleep well and dream of simpler family trees. Let's pause for some medieval logic. Marrying your cousin was actually smart if you wanted to keep the family fortune away from strangers. Unfortunately, this strategy was less romantic comedy and more biology experiment gone rogue. Tonight, you'll learn how kings and queens justified picking a spouse who was already in the family portrait. Imagine this. You're a young royal, swaddled in velvet and privilege, but you're also a strategic asset with a pulse. Your life isn't your own. It's a political negotiation in silk breeches. In the great palace halls of Europe, your marriage isn't about finding your soulmate or falling in love by moonlight. It's about not letting the family jewels, or worse, the crown itself, fall into the hands of an outsider. In this world, romance is optional. Genetics is negotiable. And keeping it in the family? That's just smart business. Let's break down the why. For centuries, royal power was all about land, wealth, and the right name. Borders were shaky, alliances were fleeting, and the only thing a king could really trust was his own bloodline, preferably as undiluted as possible. So, when it came time to arrange a marriage, rulers scoured Europe for suitable matches, then promptly circled back to the family's own living room. If you could tie the knot with a cousin, a niece, or even, occasionally, a double first cousin, why not? At least you knew where they'd spent their childhood and which embarrassing stories to avoid at banquets. But behind every royal wedding lurked a set of calculations worthy of an accountant with a very relaxed attitude toward genetic diversity. Who owns which castle? Who's got claims to the richer vineyards? Is your bride to be the type who can strengthen your alliance with the French? Or is she already signed up to marry your brother's son's nephew's daughter? Which, yes, has happened. The match had to be perfect, not for happiness, but for politics. Royal mothers were the original matchmakers, organizing elaborate feasts, dances, and endless rounds of subtle hints. You know, sweetie, your cousin Leopold is looking very robust this season. Meanwhile, the young royals in question had as much choice as a chess piece. Imagine growing up with a handful of eligible cousins as your entire dating pool. It's like being on the world's smallest, most awkward episode of The Bachelor, except the final rose comes with a side of mutual grandparents. If you're picturing a scene full of bashful glances and heartfelt proposals, think again. Most royal marriages were arranged before the couple had ever met. Diplomats and ambassadors negotiated on behalf of toddlers. Contracts were drawn up for infants. And in the rare case that a royal actually fell in love with someone outside the family, that was considered a scandal, a dangerous breach of protocol that could plunge an entire continent into war, or even worse, an embarrassing headline in the royal newsletter. Of course, there were downsides. The more royals doubled down on cousine marriage, the smaller their family tree became, until it started to look more like a pretzel than a towering oak. The same family names repeated for generations, leading to an endless parade of Charleses, Louises, and Ferdinands. Holidays were a blur of identical faces and recycled anecdotes. Remember when Uncle Charles ate a candle by mistake? Which Uncle Charles? All of them. But for all the eyebrow-raising genetics, there was a method to the madness. Marrying within the family did, for a while, keep dynasties stable and properties consolidated. The royal houses of Europe survived centuries of intrigue and rebellion by building alliances that were, quite literally, closer than skin deep. Unfortunately, they also handed down a few less desirable traits, like the infamous Habsburg jaw, mysterious illnesses, and the kind of family drama that would make a soap opera producer blush. So as you tuck in tonight, reflect on the world's longest-running episode of Family Feud, one played out in palaces, ballrooms, and candlelit bedchambers across the continent. The matchmaking Olympics were less about love and more about legacy, less about passion and more about property. And if you ever feel like your own family gatherings are a bit much, remember, at least you don't need a genealogical chart to figure out if your date is your second cousin. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with romance, variety, and the freedom to marry absolutely anyone you want. Welcome to royal nursery life. You've got golden rattles, armies of servants, and a playroom where your siblings are also your second cousins twice removed. But don't expect to run wild. Overprotective parents, court physicians, and a lurking sense of genetic dread keep you tucked up tight, swaddled in silk and uncertainty. Let's ease into your day as a royal child. You awaken in a cradle that costs more than a village, your blanket trimmed in real gold thread, and sunlight pouring through leaded glass. Outside, peasants are already working the fields, but you're serenaded awake by a nursemaid singing a lullaby about family pride and the benefits of never leaving the palace. Before you've even had breakfast, 3 adults have checked your pulse, taken your temperature, and discussed your constitution. It's like being raised by a focus group. The palace nursery is a strange, splendid, and sometimes suffocating world. There are endless toys, spinning tops, painted soldiers, dollhouses as large as garden sheds, and puzzles depicting ancestors whose chins could double as doorstops. But be careful, don't play too rough. Inbred royal children were often fragile, and the tiniest cough was treated like a diplomatic incident. The mere threat of a runny nose could send the court physician into a full-scale panic, summoning herbalists and muttering prayers to every saint with a vaguely medical background. Daily life is tightly scheduled and gently padded. After breakfast, served on porcelain plates and supervised by a rotation of taste testers, you're marched off to lessons. Tutors arrive with stacks of books, maps, and the endless expectation that you'll speak 5 languages by age 6. You're taught fencing, carefully, with blunted swords, music, preferably harp, nothing too exciting, and enough royal etiquette to survive 3 coronations and a minor uprising. Every moment is managed, every lesson another building block in the wall that keeps you inside the royal bubble. Your classmates? Other royal kids, who also happen to be your cousins, your rivals, and, if the marriage negotiations go poorly, your future spouse. Socializing isn't about making friends so much as learning how to keep secrets, sniff out intrigue, and avoid getting caught sneaking marzipan from the kitchen. There's a constant, unspoken competition, who can quote Latin the fastest, who looks the most regal when pouting, and who can faint on command at the mention of leeches, but there's an underlying tension that no amount of toy soldiers can distract from. The adults hover like anxious bees, worried that every stumble or fever is a sign of the family curse. Inbreeding. Court physicians track every rash and hiccup in leather-bound ledgers. If you're too quiet, it's melancholy. If you're too lively, it's nerves. If you have a tooth coming in crooked, there are urgent whispers and an emergency portrait session, just in case history needs to remember what you looked like before things went sideways. Still, there are moments of sweetness. A ride in the garden on a pony so well bred it probably knows your lineage by heart. Secret games in the attic with a sibling who shares your exact jawline, and stories whispered late at night about kingdoms won and lost by children not so different from you. And if you're lucky, a governess who lets you get away with a harmless prank or two, provided you don't endanger international relations or knock over a priceless vase. As you drift toward bedtime, the palace is quieter, but the anxiety never quite leaves. You're tucked in beneath a mountain of blankets while a servant checks the fireplace for ghosts, and the nursemaid makes one last prayer for your continued health and political utility. Because in the royal bubble, childhood is a mixture of luxury, surveillance, and suspense. Sleep well, little heir. Tomorrow, you'll wake up to more lessons, more toys, and the ever-present shadow of the family tree. Imagine waking up with symptoms so weird, even your royal doctor just shrugs. Seizures, club feet, extra fingers, and more than a few mysterious allergies. When you keep marrying close relatives, the gene pool starts sending out warning signals. Tonight, we'll catalogue some of history's least enviable family heirlooms. Let's drop you into a royal bedroom at dawn. The candlelight flickers as three physicians huddle at the end of your bed, exchanging worried glances and debating if your rash is a sign of divine punishment or just too many candied figs at supper. As an inbred royal, you're not just battling for the throne. You're fighting your own DNA every morning. There's a good chance you've inherited something unique, something the medical textbooks haven't seen before. Mostly because the textbooks haven't been written yet. Take your pick of the symptoms. Maybe you wake up with a jaw so crooked it looks like you're perpetually mid-giggle. Maybe your eyelids droop or your tongue seems just a little too big for polite company. The Habsburgs, for instance, collected rare medical conditions the way some people collect postage stamps. Mandibular prognathism, that's the infamous Habsburg jaw, epilepsy, and a delightful selection of developmental disorders were just the beginning. Some royal children sprouted extra digits, polydactyly, in case you're planning to impress friends at your next trivia night, or were born with club feet, scoliosis, or skin so sensitive even silk pajamas felt like sandpaper. In a time when the medical community thought sneezing was caused by evil spirits and the cure for everything was more leeches, royal ailments weren't just a personal issue, they were a matter of national security. If a young heir couldn't walk, speak clearly, or hold a scepter without trembling, the gossip mill shifted into overdrive. Ambassadors wrote home in code. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, and every time you caught a cold, a dozen nations held their breath. Forget Google. The only search engine was the old family midwife, who'd seen enough cousin marriages to know the warning signs. But it wasn't just physical. Some royal children suffered from mysterious seizures, sudden fits, tremors, and fainting spells that left doctors recommending everything from cold baths to exorcisms. In Spain, Charles II's long list of symptoms included epilepsy and a kind of persistent brain fog that left his advisors tiptoeing around topics like complex decision-making and how to sit up straight. In Russia, some Romanov children inherited hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that turned every playground scratch into a full-blown crisis. Imagine playing tag while your nurse follows you with a pillow, just in case you trip over a priceless tapestry. Then there were the allergies, sometimes to food, sometimes to sunlight, sometimes heartbreakingly to basic hygiene. A simple rash could spiral into a court-wide panic, with doctors arriving from neighboring kingdoms to poke, prod, and prescribe. A little fresh air, one would say. A bath in goat's milk, another insisted. Have you tried burning all the bed sheets? Medicine was part science, part superstition, and almost always hopelessly optimistic. The royal family was the original clinical trial, minus the informed consent and with a lot more brocade. Of course, most peasants never heard the details. Official portraits always showed glowing cheeks and upright posture, never the hunched shoulders, drooping eyelids, or the extra finger strategically hidden behind a scepter. In private, though, even the bravest kings and queens sometimes winced at their own reflections. The lucky ones made it to adulthood. Many didn't, their symptoms outpacing medieval medicine's best efforts. So, as you snuggle deeper into your modern bed, remember, the royal gene pool was more of a family puddle, and the list of royal ailments reads like the worst menu in history. If you ever wake up with a headache, be grateful it's probably just too much screen time, and not a national crisis requiring 6 doctors and a papal blessing. Sleep well, and may your dreams be symptom-free. Queen Victoria's family wasn't just famous, they were hemophiliacs. The royal disease spread like a party invitation, showing up in courts from Russia to Spain. Suddenly, a scraped knee was a major diplomatic incident, and royal kids lived in a world padded with silk and medical anxiety. Let's set the scene. You wake up as the child of a European monarch in the late 19th century. Your nursery is a museum of luxury, all velvet curtains and gilded cribs, but there's an extra layer of caution woven into every detail. Where other children are told to be careful as they dash off to play, your every move is shadowed by a watchful nurse, a nervous mother, and at least 2 physicians. The reason? Your blood doesn't clot like it's supposed to. In a world before antibiotics, sterile bandages, or even a proper understanding of germs, this was less of a quirk and more of a daily emergency drill. Hemophilia wasn't just any genetic mishap. It was a time bomb hidden in the bloodstream, passed down through Queen Victoria and distributed generously to her many grandchildren, thanks to a gene that doesn't know the meaning of borders. Queen Victoria, blissfully unaware, became known as the grandmother of Europe. Her sons and daughters married into nearly every major royal house. And with them, the hemophilia gene hitched a ride straight into the palaces of Germany, Spain, and most dramatically, Russia. Suddenly, a stubbed toe or an innocent tumble was enough to trigger a full-blown crisis. Imagine being a young prince or princess, forbidden from running, jumping, or wrestling with your cousins in the garden. No games of hide-and-seek on the marble staircases. No sword fights, not even with wooden swords. Every activity was a calculated risk, weighed against the possibility of a bruise that wouldn't heal or a joint that would swell and ache for weeks. Your life is a series of, no, you can't, and not today, maybe never, enforced by a wall of anxious adults who flinch every time you stand up too fast. Let's take a look at Russia's tragic hemophiliac prince, Alexei Romanov. The only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, Alexei's condition was the Romanov family secret, hidden from the public but ruling every moment of palace life. When Alexei fell or banged his knee, his parents summoned doctors, priests, and finally the mysterious Rasputin, whose soothing presence, or at least the threat of being thrown out a window, seemed to help when nothing else would. Family letters and diaries are full of desperation, accounts of Alexei's pain, of the Empress's prayers, of the agony of watching a child suffer while being utterly powerless to help. But Alexei was far from alone. The disease afflicted Victoria's Spanish grandsons and several German princes as well. The royal disease became a source of diplomatic tension and whispered gossip, a topic delicately avoided at royal dinners but dissected endlessly behind closed doors. Potential marriage alliances were scrutinized for any hint of the dreaded gene. Some royal mothers became amateur geneticists, tracking family trees and praying for daughters instead of sons, since the disease was passed through the female line but only manifested in boys. Imagine being a princess, praised for your beauty, but secretly valued even more for your clean bloodline. Medicine had little to offer. Bleeding was controlled with pressure, bed rest, and, if you were very lucky, a doctor who didn't suggest something medieval, like leeches. In some cases, experimental treatments were attempted, ranging from herbal infusions to electrical therapy. Mostly, though, the cure was avoidance. Avoid sharp corners, avoid excitement, avoid anything that might hint at fun. For the royal children, this meant a bubble-wrapped existence. Siblings, friends, and tutors learned to tiptoe around the topic, never mentioning the real reason for your careful, sheltered life. And yet, the disease continued its silent campaign, shaping dynasties, altering marriages, and, eventually, changing the course of history itself. So as you turn over in bed tonight, be grateful that a paper cut is nothing more than a minor annoyance. For Queen Victoria's descendants, a single scratch could be a headline. Sleep well, and may your dreams be blissfully boring and bruise-free. When you're a royal child with a mystery illness, 19th century medicine is your only hope. Forget about antibiotics, think leeches, herbal teas, and the occasional exorcism. Doctors tried everything, from draining blood to prescribing dangerous concoctions. Sometimes the cure was worse than the condition. Let's get comfortable, well, as comfortable as you can be when you're about to experience the finest healthcare medieval and early modern Europe had to offer. You've just woken up feeling off. Maybe it's a headache. Maybe it's a strange ache in your side. Or maybe your jaw is just a bit too Habsburg for comfort. Instantly, the palace swings into action. Maids scurry for the royal physician, courtiers whisper, and within minutes, your bedchamber is filled with the best educated men in the kingdom. Too bad their medical degrees are written in Latin and based mostly on gut feelings and ancient Greek philosophy. The diagnosis always begins with a thorough inspection by candlelight in front of a full audience. No pressure. Your doctor peers down your throat, checks your pulse, and probably asks about the last time you saw a comet, just in case. The most popular theory? The four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you're sick, it's because these are out of balance. The solution? Rebalance them by taking some of your blood out and seeing what happens. Here come the leeches. Yes, leeches. Small, slimy, and oddly enthusiastic. They are summoned from a velvet-lined jar and applied with great ceremony to your arms, legs, and, if you're very unlucky, your face. The doctor assures you it's perfectly safe, which is easy for him to say, since he's not the one being turned into an all-you-can-eat buffet. If the leeches don't work, it's time for bloodletting. A small cut, a fancy bowl to catch the results, and plenty of prayers that you don't faint before breakfast. Sometimes the leeches and bloodletting are followed by purging, herbs, salts, or whatever else the apothecary can find to cleanse you. In other words, expect to spend quality time near a chamber pot. Maybe you're lucky, and the royal doctor prescribes a soothing herbal tea. Chamomile, valerian, minter sometimes. Something a little more experimental like mercury arsenic or powdered toad. If your condition is stubborn, someone will call for a priest, just in case your headache is the result of an angry ancestor or a vengeful saint. Between doses of holy water and chanting, your bedroom starts to feel more like a cross between a pharmacy and a haunted house. There's always a new remedy to try. Maybe you'll be wrapped in warm blankets, then in cold sheets, then have your feet dunked in icy water to draw out the fever. If you're feeling faint, your governess might wave smelling salts under your nose or force you to sniff vinegar. Some remedies are weirdly pleasant, like a massage with rose oil, but even those come with dire warnings about overstimulating the blood. Heaven forbid you enjoy the process. Meanwhile, the adults in your life are locked in an ongoing debate over which remedy works best. The French doctor swears by hot poultices and garlic. The German physician recommends fresh air and discipline. The Spanish midwife just wants to burn some incense and hope for the best. Each new specialist adds a new layer of confusion. You get the distinct impression that your symptoms are less important than your pedigree. The main concern is keeping the heir alive, no matter how many jars of leeches it takes. For most royal children, getting better meant surviving the treatment, not just the illness. With every cough or chill, you could expect a parade of hopeful, well-meaning, but hopelessly outdated cures. By the time you reached adulthood, if you reached adulthood, you'd tried more home remedies than a modern wellness influencer on a 3-day juice cleanse. So as you fall asleep, spare a grateful thought for modern medicine. No leeches, no bloodletting, no chance of a priest showing up with holy water for your seasonal allergies. For the royal children of old, hope came in jars, prayers, and a healthy dose of denial. Here's to sleeping soundly, with all your humours blissfully in balance. Ever notice how royal family portraits look like they were painted using the same 4 faces, rearranged? That's not just the artist being lazy. When everyone's related, the family resemblance gets a little uncanny. Welcome to a gallery where every child looks like their cousin, their aunt, and possibly their grandfather's horse. Imagine stepping into a royal portrait hall, a long gallery lined with gilded frames, red velvet drapes, and the stern eyes of 100 ancestors staring down at you. If you squint, it starts to look like one of those spot-the-difference puzzles. A chin here, a nose there, maybe a particularly heroic eyebrow. But fundamentally, the same faces repeat. You'd be forgiven for thinking the artist ran out of ideas, but the truth is far more genetic. This is the visual evidence of centuries spent playing matchmaker with the same 10 families. It starts in childhood. You're a royal kid, dressed in your finest brocade, and plopped onto a velvet cushion for a sitting that will last longer than your patience. The painter fusses, fixes your lace collar, and tries to capture that regal innocence. What he's really doing is documenting the latest edition of the family face. The Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon nose, the Romanov eyes, all shuffled together in various combinations, like an extremely exclusive deck of cards. It's not your imagination. It's hereditary déjà vu. For the artist, this job is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, you can pretty much copy last year's portrait, and no one will notice. On the other, there's the impossible task of making each new child look unique. When they all have the same overbite, the same puffy eyelids, and the same slightly confused expression. You try your best. Maybe you add a pet spaniel, a fancy feather, or a lute. But in the end, you're still painting the same jawline for the 6th time this week. Palace gossip swirls around these sessions. Courtiers nudge each other and whisper, "Oh, she has her father's smile, pity about the ears." Grandmothers sigh over inherited dimples. Sometimes, if the resemblance is particularly dramatic, it becomes a source of private amusement. Line up all the infantas and tell me which one is Maria, a Spanish nobleman might joke, as 10 identically dressed princesses parade past. In family albums, it's less about preserving memories and more about charting the slow, relentless march of dominant genes. It wasn't just the Habsburgs, although they were the undisputed world champions of genetic repetition. Look at any royal family tree, from the Tudors to the Romanovs, and you'll see the same phenomenon. The obsession with pure bloodlines, the near-mythic importance of keeping it in the family, led to dynasties where the best way to identify a royal was by their profile silhouette. Artists, trapped between flattery and reality, sometimes chose to improve the family features. Noses magically straightened, chins softened, eyes brightened. But for the most part, the resemblance was impossible to hide. Sometimes the similarity became a political liability. Rivals pointed to portraits as proof of inbreeding. Circulating sketches of goggle-eyed heirs and famously lopsided monarchs. Even in the rare event of marrying outside the usual circle, the resulting children usually still looked more like a rerun than a reboot. Imagine sending your portrait to a foreign princess as part of marriage negotiations and having her reply, "He's lovely, but didn't I meet him last year at my own cousin's wedding?" If you grew up surrounded by these portraits, it was hard to develop a strong sense of individuality. Everywhere you turned, you saw yourself reflected, refracted, and slightly reinterpreted by artists desperate for variety. Maybe you started experimenting, a new hairdo, a fresh mustache, or an especially creative hat. But deep down, you knew you'd always be part of the pattern, one more face in the grand genetic wallpaper of history. So, as you close your eyes tonight, picture yourself walking through the portrait gallery of your own family. Be grateful for a little genetic diversity, for childhood photos where your siblings look like themselves, and for the modern miracle of being able to smile without a committee of ancestors looking over your shoulder. Sleep well, and may your dreams feature only original faces. For Spanish royal children, every birthday was a victory. High infant mortality, fragile health, and the relentless pressure to produce heirs made royal childhood less about luxury and more about survival. Being born with a title was no guarantee you'd survive to use it. Let's slip quietly into a Spanish palace nursery in the 16th or 17th century. The air smells of lavender and candle wax, mingling with the faint, constant undertone of anxiety. You, the newest infanta or infante, are swaddled in silk and placed in a cradle so ornate it could double as a reliquary. There are nurses, governesses, and priests hovering nearby, not so much to entertain you, but to monitor every hiccup and fever, every unsettling sound you make in the night. From the moment you take your first breath, everyone's holding theirs. The Spanish royal family, with its proud lineages and tangled branches, put a premium on healthy heirs. Every new child brought a wave of hope. Maybe this one would outlast the relentless parade of illnesses and misfortune that haunted the House of Habsburg. But hope was fragile. Most royal infants were born into a world where even a mild cold could become fatal, where doctors prescribed treatments with names like the Blessed Purge or application of holy relics. Childhood was less about playtime and more about surviving your own genetics. If you were a little princess, a Spanish infanta, your world was beautiful but suffocating. Dressed in stiff brocade, weighed down by jewelry, you spent your days learning prayers, etiquette, and the delicate art of not making any sudden moves. Play was allowed, but cautiously supervised. Running or climbing was discouraged. Anything that could result in a scrape or a bruise was practically treason. Your immune system was up against not just smallpox and measles, but also the long, invisible arm of inbreeding. Siblings were sometimes more like ghostly reminders of what could go wrong. Infants lost to the fever, toddlers to mysterious wasting diseases, and older brothers who just stopped waking up. Court life didn't help. Palaces were drafty, crowded, and full of hazards. Open fires, stone floors, and endless drafts turned childhood into a daily obstacle course, one you had to navigate while wearing clothes that made it difficult to move, let alone escape a sudden chill. Servants whispered superstitions, and every time a child coughed, a dozen remedies were fetched. Priests sprinkled holy water. Physicians recommended poultices, prayers, or, if things got desperate, tiny doses of arsenic. If you showed signs of illness, you were isolated. Sometimes, you never came out. The reality of royal childhood was measured in funerals as much as christenings. In the crypts beneath royal chapels, rows of tiny coffins told the true story. Portraits painted of infantas who barely survived long enough to sit for them, cheeks artfully rosy, eyes a little too solemn, became family relics. For every heir who lived to adulthood, there were 2 or 3 whose names were lost in the ledgers. Official records, so meticulous in charting family trees and royal marriages, often summed up a life with a single word: died. Yet even with this shadow always present, royal families pressed on. The birth of every infanta was greeted with prayers, bells, and cautious optimism. Entire courts waited anxiously for news. Had the baby made it through the night? Would this child's name be added to the roll call at the next feast, or whispered quietly in mourning? Royal mothers faced unimaginable pressure. Blamed for every stillbirth, every infant fever, every sign that the bloodline might be weakening. So as you drift into sleep tonight, picture the nursery where hope was laced with fear and every laugh was muffled by worry. For the Spanish infantas, survival was never guaranteed, just a fragile, flickering possibility. If you've ever taken a healthy childhood for granted, remember the tiny coffins hidden below the marble floors and the courage of those who grew up beneath a crown and a curse. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of sunlight and certainty. From the mad King George to various melancholic monarchs, mental illness was a frequent visitor to royal courts. Some kings raved, some queens wept, and the royal advisors mostly pretended not to notice, until the country started falling apart. Let's set the scene. It's dawn in the royal bedchamber, but there's little hope of a peaceful day. You, a royal child, wake up to whispers outside your door. Sometimes it's just servants gossiping about your mother's latest crying spell. Sometimes it's ministers anxiously debating if the king will even come out today. Inbreeding wasn't just a matter of jawlines and family trees that looked suspiciously like subway maps. It was a direct ticket to hereditary mental instability. And in royal families, mental health wasn't a private affair. It was the business of the entire nation. Take the famous case of King George III of England. In the late 1700s, King George began acting strangely, talking endlessly, writing rambling letters, and holding long conversations with trees, which, to be fair, might have been more reasonable than talking to some of his ministers. The court physicians couldn't agree if he was suffering from madness, melancholia, or the always popular imbalanced humors. The truth, as we now suspect, is that George inherited a genetic disorder, porphyria, perhaps, amplified by centuries of tight-knit royal marriages. His suffering became a public spectacle, a tragic drama that played out not just in palaces, but in Parliament and the newspapers. The phrase "Mad King George" became shorthand for royal disaster. It wasn't just kings, either. Queen Maria I of Portugal was nicknamed Maria the Mad, her moods swinging wildly between cheerful hope and bottomless sorrow. Her reign was punctuated by religious obsessions, long periods of silence, and public outbursts. When tragedy struck, like the death of her husband and son, she slid into despair so deep that the business of ruling ground to a halt. Advisors quietly moved her to a secluded palace, making sure the curtains were always drawn and her fits remained private. In a time before psychology, her suffering was attributed to weak nerves or sometimes the devil himself. Behind the heavy curtains, royal children grew up surrounded by this uncertainty. You never knew if today's lesson would be interrupted by a screaming fit, or if tomorrow's breakfast would include a surprise exorcism. Mental illness in royal families was kept as secret as possible, hidden away in distant country estates or masked with elaborate rituals. But when your mother is pacing the halls in tears or your father is convinced he's made of glass, there's only so much hiding you can do. Gossip spread faster than the flu, and foreign ambassadors made careful notes on every sign of instability. The royal response was often more spectacle than solution. Physicians tried everything: leeches, herbal teas, prayer marathons, and the occasional freezing bath. Some unlucky royals were strapped to beds or dosed with opiates until they barely remembered their own names. But mostly, everyone hoped the crisis would pass and the monarchy could get back to business. It rarely did. Chronic mental illness meant uncertainty at the top, and that trickled down to every corner of the kingdom. But here's the truth behind the tapestries. These monarchs were as vulnerable as any of us. Their sadnesses, fears, and madnesses were often the logical result of too much family, too little privacy, and the immense pressure to hold entire nations together, while desperately trying not to unravel themselves. Sometimes the bravest thing a royal could do was simply get out of bed in the morning. So as you settle into sleep, reflect on the silent battles waged behind palace doors. The crowns were heavy, the portraits imposing, but the minds beneath them were fragile. Tonight, wish yourself a little peace and remember that, royal or not, everyone has storms that rage unseen. Sleep well, and let your dreams be calm, bright, and mercifully free of court physicians and court intrigue. Ever wonder why some royal children wore those enormous collars or long, elaborate sleeves? Sometimes it was just fashion. Sometimes it was to hide a hunchback, a twitch, or a jawline that startled the horses. In the royal wardrobe, style often doubled as camouflage. Let's get you dressed for the day. You wake up in a palace room with sunlight barely peeking through heavy velvet drapes. The court tailor arrives, armed with an arsenal of brocades, silks, ribbons, and enough starch to immobilize a small army. For most people, getting dressed is about comfort or self-expression. For you, the royal child, it's about distraction. Distraction from a slightly wandering eye, a club foot, or perhaps a chin that could double as a letter opener. Royal fashion was an endless parade of cloaks, collars, and cuffs designed as much to conceal as to impress. Take a look at those famous paintings. Lace ruffs wide enough to serve hors d'oeuvre, voluminous gowns that made it impossible to sit down, sleeves that swish and swirl and swallow your hands whole. If you suffered from a tremor, just add another layer of embroidered fabric. No one will see your shaking hands beneath all that brocade. Got a limp? Stiff, heavy boots might help you walk with majesty. Even crowns themselves, with their strategic peaks and sparkling jewels, could draw the eye away from a lopsided hairline or an ear that never quite matched the other. Inbreeding, that relentless royal tradition, left a legacy of physical quirks and ailments, some obvious, some best kept under wraps. The court dressmakers quickly learned to work their magic. Habsburg jaw, time for a beard as grand as a tapestry. Scoliosis? A high-backed chair for formal portraits, flanked by enough drapery to cover the leaning tower of Pisa. A princess with a delicate constitution might find herself trussed up in whalebone corsets so tight she couldn't faint even if she wanted to. Royal children were sometimes sewn quite literally into their garments, for support as much as style. Behind closed doors, parents, doctors, and tailors plotted strategies to keep every blemish, oddity, or nervous tic out of public view. This wasn't just about vanity. It was about politics. An heir who looked weak or unusual could become the target of gossip, foreign ridicule, or even coup attempts. In a world where strength and beauty were equated with divine favor, hiding flaws was a matter of dynastic survival. Some courtiers whispered that the fashion in Spain for huge, stiff collars began when one unlucky infante's neck decided to lean in a direction never before attempted by vertebrates, and the pressure didn't let up for a moment. Banquets, public audiences, religious festivals, every occasion was a potential fashion show, and every fashion show was a test. You learned to move with slow, deliberate grace. Not just to look regal, but to avoid tripping over your own sleeves or revealing a limp. Young royals spent hours practicing postures in front of mirrors, learning which angles minimized the family nose, or how to hold a fan to hide trembling fingers. No detail was too small. Gloves were essential, partly to show off embroidered cuffs, partly to hide hands that shook or bore the marks of hereditary diseases. Of course, sometimes the camouflage became the fashion itself. After enough years, everyone wanted a collar as wide as the Queen's, even if their jawline was perfectly ordinary. Trends spread outward from the palace, until nobles and even wealthy commoners were suffering for style. wrapping themselves in so many layers they could barely walk to dinner. So, as you nestle into your pajamas tonight, grateful for elastic waistbands and tagless t-shirts, spare a thought for those royal children wrapped up like Christmas gifts every morning. Their fashion wasn't just a statement, it was a shield. If your clothes hide nothing more than a stain or a stubborn belly, consider yourself lucky. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with soft fabrics, gentle seams, and all the freedom to move your arms you could ever want. Your menu tonight includes roast peacock, questionable stews, and so much sugar your teeth would stage a protest, if you had any. Royal diets weren't exactly balanced, and when you add in a little inbreeding, dinner could turn into a medical drama. Let's wander down the grand staircase into the royal dining hall, a room where the ceilings are high, the candles plentiful, and the food both a spectacle and a science experiment. As a royal child, your table is set with the finest silver, goblets carved from rock crystal, and plates piled high with dishes you can't pronounce. Cooks in the palace kitchen are competing for favor by stuffing, roasting, and sugaring everything in sight. If you can eat it, they will try to make it impressive. If you can't eat it, well, they'll try to make it look impressive anyway. The first course might be an elaborate soup, thick with cream and floating with things like almonds, shredded game birds, or even the occasional gold leaf. For a child with a delicate constitution or a jaw that refuses to close, soup is less a starter and more of a main event. A little bread, tough enough to threaten dental work, is provided for dipping, assuming you can manage it without alerting the family physician. Every dish is presented as if the Pope himself were coming to dinner. But for royal children whose teeth and stomachs are already questionable, the display can feel like a medieval obstacle course. After the soup comes the parade of meats: roast boar, stuffed swan, venison glazed in honey, and, if you're lucky, something your body can actually digest. The more exotic the animal, the better. Porcupine, flamingo, hedgehog pie, nothing is off limits. If it lived, walked, flew, or swam, someone in the kitchen has probably tried to serve it wrapped in bacon and covered in royal sauce. Vegetables? An afterthought, usually boiled beyond recognition and seasoned with whatever was left over from last week's spice shipment. The color green rarely appears at the royal table, unless you count decorative herbs. But no royal meal is complete without dessert, an event in itself. Here's where sugar, a luxury imported at dizzying cost, becomes the star of the show. There are marzipan sculptures, candied fruits, and pastries piled higher than a toddler's sense of self-importance. For royal children, dessert isn't just a treat, it's a daily expectation. Sweets are so prevalent that if you make it to age 10 with all your teeth, the court dentist wants a portrait. Unfortunately, sugar, in combination with less than perfect Habsburg jaw alignment, means the dental future is bleak. Toothaches are common, and extractions, performed by the same barber who cuts your hair, are just another part of growing up royal. And don't forget the drinks. Clean water is for peasants and horses. At the royal table, you'll sip watered-down wine, small beer, or sometimes even spiced milk, depending on your age and your doctor's opinion on what's appropriate. If you're a hemophiliac prince, or an infant with a digestive system best described as experimental, there's a good chance someone is adding herbal tinctures to your cup, just in case. Of course, not all royal children could actually enjoy this feast. Between fragile jaws, allergies, and a whole portfolio of genetic ailments, many meals were a struggle. Special dishes would be made for those with trouble swallowing, and servants would hover with napkins, ready to catch a royal cough or an unexpected sneeze. Court physicians often hovered nearby too, eyeing every bite as if a slice of almond cake might lead to international crisis. At some tables, family members would discreetly swap foods or press uneaten meat into the hands of a favorite servant when nobody was looking. So, as you drift off tonight, dreaming of snacks, remember, being royal didn't mean easy eating. Dinner was a high-stakes performance, a balancing act between opulence and indigestion, sugar and survival. May your dreams be filled with balanced meals, soft bread, and a dentist who doesn't double as a surgeon. Sleep well, and may all your feasts be easy to chew. If you thought your parents wanted grandkids, try being a royal child. The entire country is holding its breath for a healthy heir. Doctors, priests, and astrologers hover at your cradle, and any sign of weakness is a crisis for the kingdom. Let's open your royal nursery door to a parade of nervous adults. There's your mother, the queen, pale from too many sleepless nights. Beside her, the king looks worriedly at the midwife, as if she could guarantee a son who isn't allergic to sunlight or fainting at the sight of a turnip. A priest mumbles prayers. The royal doctor takes copious notes on your pulse, the color of your spit, and how vigorously you manage to hiccup. Meanwhile, the palace astrologer is outside, peering at the moon, trying to decide if your star sign spells prosperity or just another case of mysterious wasting disease. From the moment a royal child is born, the pressure is immense. It isn't enough to simply exist. You must thrive, and preferably as a boy. In Europe's great dynasties, a healthy male heir was the insurance policy that kept wars at bay, peasants at peace, and noble families from starting secret meetings at suspicious hours. The death or illness of a royal child could send shockwaves through an entire country. Heir presumptive today, national crisis tomorrow. The expectations don't end at birth. Your milestones, how soon you sit up, whether you can eat solid food, if your first word is papa or diplomatic incident, are scrutinized by an audience of anxious onlookers. The first sign of a cough, a limp, or a suspicious rash prompts another round of frantic remedies. If you were slow to walk, the nursemaid started whispering about curses. If you sneezed in winter, someone sent for holy water and doubled the draft-stopping tapestries. And it's not just family. All of Europe is invested in your survival. Foreign ambassadors send coded letters back home. The infant prince looks robust, they might write, although his ears seem to be moving east. In times of uncertainty, rumors flew like pigeons. One moment the prince is thriving, the next he's rumored to have grown a second thumb. Sometimes the rumors were just wishful thinking from a rival dynasty, hoping for a sudden vacancy at the top. The obsession with healthy heirs wasn't purely personal. It was intensely political. If a king produced no sons or only daughters, his legitimacy could be questioned. Civil wars, disputed claims, and general chaos could ensue. Royal marriages were organized and reorganized, with the hope of maximizing the odds for a sturdy male successor. Queens who failed to produce healthy boys often faced exile, accusations of witchcraft, or just years of cold stares across the breakfast table. Some tried anything: pilgrimages, magic charms, miracle waters, and, of course, even more cousin marriages, because if it hasn't worked for 3 generations, why not try a 4th? The constant scrutiny shaped royal childhood into a sort of marathon. Lessons in fencing, riding, and statecraft started young. After all, a sickly heir couldn't inspire armies or lead troops into battle. Playtime was limited, supervised, and sometimes replaced with lessons in how to stand straight for portraits or hold a ceremonial sword without dropping it. For girls, the pressure was only slightly less. Be healthy, be pretty, and be ready to marry a cousin who might one day be king. Every birthday was celebrated with a hint of anxiety. If you made it to age 10, there were feasts and prayers. If you caught a cold at 12, half the continent braced for bad news. And every step of the way, your body and mind weren't really your own. They belonged to history, to your dynasty, and to a future that could be upended by a cough. So tonight, as you snuggle into your own bed, appreciate that your worth isn't measured by your pulse or your pedigree. For royal children, every breath was both a blessing and a political event. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free from court intrigue and drafty castles. Forget dating apps. Your marriage was arranged before you could spell your own name, and your list of potential spouses looked suspiciously similar to your family tree. Royal matchmaking was less about love and more about politics, treaties, and, occasionally, the available gene pool. Let's join you as a young royal, sitting at the breakfast table, barely tall enough to see over your goblet of watered wine, while your parents casually debate which cousin or distant relative you'll be pledged to before dessert. Across the table, your sibling is already promised to an archduchess 3 countries over, and your other sibling is being considered as a bargaining chip in next week's alliance negotiations. Childhood crushes? Dream on. Your marriage will be organized for you, signed, sealed, and announced before you can even develop a preference for hair color or, frankly, gender. For royal families, marriage was a diplomatic chess game. Treaties were sealed not with handshakes but with vows and rings. Every eligible prince and princess was an asset to be spent wisely, maximizing land, power, or the chance to keep a rival country from growing too strong. The rules of the marriage market were strict. Only royals could marry royals. And, if possible, it was best to stick to relatives, because outsiders might have annoying ideas about independence or, worse, genetic diversity. So, as a royal child, your future is mapped out on parchment, with elaborate family trees, heraldic diagrams, and the occasional footnote warning of recent madness or a surplus of extra toes in your proposed spouse's lineage. Suitors are vetted not for their personality but for their pedigree. Can they bring more territory? Are their parents likely to start a war? Has anyone in their family married outside the usual cousin circuit? If so, scandal. If not, congratulations, you're headed for a lifetime of family reunions doubling as anniversary parties. And then, there's the ceremony itself. Royal weddings weren't private affairs, but continent-wide spectacles, with guest lists stretching from Vienna to Madrid and enough food to feed a city, if anyone could actually digest the marzipan swans and peacock pies. The bride and groom might meet for the first time at the altar, smiling politely as court painters capture the joyous union for posterity. It was tradition for royal children to rehearse their roles long before adulthood. Girls learned the choreography of the bridal procession before they learned multiplication. Boys practiced bowing to future in-laws whose names they could barely pronounce. Of course, sometimes negotiations fell apart. Betrothals were broken as often as they were made, usually when a better alliance came along. Royal children became bargaining chips, recalled from one engagement only to be pledged to another, often with minimal explanation and even less concern for personal feelings. Some lucky princes and princesses managed to marry someone they actually liked, but more often, happiness was considered a pleasant accident rather than a goal. The results? The European royals ended up so interconnected that you could pick any two at random and, with a few leaps across the family shrub, discover they shared great-grandparents. Marrying a cousin was not just common, it was almost mandatory. It kept the bloodline pure, the estates together, and the dynasties strong, at least until all those repeated genes started causing more problems than they solved. Occasionally, a rogue royal would marry for love, outside the approved roster, causing panic in the palace and a flurry of scandalized letters across the continent. But mostly, the matchmaking game continued, each union tightening the knots in an already complicated web. Portraits lined palace walls, each couple staring solemnly ahead, as if wondering how many family trees they'd have to memorize to survive the next wedding season. So tonight, as you enjoy the luxury of choosing your own relationships, be grateful that your romantic future isn't being decided over breakfast by someone named Ferdinand with a map and a panic about borders. Sleep well, and may your dreams feature a partner of your own choosing, no pedigree required. The best part of being a royal child? Your illnesses were all carefully recorded by people who had no idea what they were seeing. Court physicians kept detailed notes, often illustrated, of rashes, swelling, fits, and fainting spells, creating a medical record for the ages and a horror story for geneticists. Let's set the scene. You wake up feeling a bit off. Maybe it's a weird rash, Maybe your ankle is suddenly bending in a direction that feels more abstract sculpture than normal joint. Immediately, the palace goes on high alert. Within minutes, your bedchamber is filled with the worried faces of physicians, scribes, and assorted relatives, all eager to witness the spectacle of your latest medical mystery. Welcome to the royal version of urgent care, where everyone is very concerned, very opinionated, and, let's be honest, very clueless. Court physicians were a special breed. Their job was to observe, diagnose, and, most importantly, write everything down, no matter how baffling. They kept enormous leather-bound ledgers, chronicling every sneeze, hiccup, and suspiciously bent finger. If you sneezed twice in the same morning, it was documented. If you broke into hives after eating swan pie, a sketch might be commissioned to immortalize your unfortunate complexion. In a world where evidence-based medicine was a foreign concept, royal children basically became case studies for the world's weirdest medical encyclopedia. The language in these records was, shall we say, creative. One entry might read, "His Royal Highness experienced a fit of melancholy, accompanied by much weeping and the sudden urge to recite psalms in Latin." Another, "The Infanta presented with an excess of yellow bile and a tendency to walk in circles after breakfast." Modern doctors might diagnose a mild fever or a genetic disorder, but in the 16th century, anything went. Astrology, humours, curses, no theory was too wild for inclusion. If your condition improved, credit was given to the prescribed leeches, or perhaps the alignment of Venus. Illustrations were an important part of the record-keeping process. Royal doctors loved a good diagram, no matter how inaccurate. Your swollen foot might be drawn twice its actual size, complete with artistic embellishments, while a particularly heroic rash could be commemorated in watercolor. Sometimes these drawings made their way into the wider world, sent to distant courts in hopes that some foreign physician could solve the mystery. Does your prince have this sort of swelling? Or is it just us? But what about privacy? Not a chance. Royal ailments were an open secret, and medical records sometimes doubled as political weapons. Rival courts gossiped about your fevers, and ambassadors sent home coded reports about your delicate constitution. If a prince looked unwell in a public procession, a wave of panic swept through the nobility. The king's health was the country's health, and the medical records kept everyone on edge. Still, there was a strange comfort in the routine. For all their confusion, court physicians took their jobs seriously, showing up day after day to observe, document, and try every remedy in the book. They may have misdiagnosed half your symptoms, but they never missed an opportunity to add a new chapter to the ongoing saga of royal childhood health. So, as you drift off tonight, picture your own childhood checkups, quick, quiet, and mercifully undocumented. Be grateful for modern medicine, HIPAA laws, and doctors who don't draw your rashes for posterity. Royal children lived in the twilight zone of diagnosis, a place where every sniffle was history in the making. Sleep well, and may your records always be boring. Life as a royal child wasn't all bad. Sometimes you got a miniature dog or an emotional support peacock. Sometimes you just stared out the window, contemplating your own reflection, which looked suspiciously like your aunt's. Either way, royal pets were the least inbred members of the family. Let's stroll through a palace corridor and listen for the distinctive click-clack of tiny paws on polished marble. In the land of anxious tutors and looming family portraits, nothing says comfort quite like a royal pet. While your parents debate alliances and your physician debates humors, your pug just wants to nap on your golden slippers and steal a bite of your dinner roll. Dogs, cats, birds, and the occasional baby monkey or fawn filled the palace with noise, chaos, and the blessed unpredictability of non-human affection. For the pampered princes and princesses of Europe, pets were far more than status symbols. They were therapy, animals before therapy was invented. Your pug doesn't care about your family tree, and your spaniel won't ask how many cousins you're expected to marry. Animals offered a rare escape from palace protocol. You could confide in your dog without fear he'd pass your secrets to the French ambassador, and cuddle your cat without worrying that she'd comment on your chin. Some royal children had pets that were truly outlandish by modern standards. Louis XIV had a beloved monkey who wore a tiny velvet suit. Spanish infantas were gifted parrots imported from the New World, though sometimes the birds picked up a few too many courtly curses. Russian princesses were rumored to have pet bears, admittedly more cub than grizzly, trained to perform tricks at winter parties. Even the famously stern Habsburgs had a soft spot for small, yappy dogs that would leap onto royal laps at the most formal dinners. Of course, pets weren't just for fun. They played their own role in palace intrigue. Who needs a spy network when your rival's parrot can be coaxed into repeating embarrassing gossip? Court artists sometimes even included favorite pets in family portraits, immortalizing the only truly innocent faces in the room. Having the right animal was a sign of status, but having one that loved you back, no matter your jawline or your ability to sit through Latin lessons, was a genuine comfort. For royal children, the pet hierarchy was nearly as complex as the family hierarchy. Senior royals got the pick of the litter. Younger siblings might end up with whatever animal hadn't escaped yet. A clever princess could sometimes bargain for a new pet in exchange for behaving at a tedious state banquet or not setting her little brother's hair on fire. Governesses tried to keep the animals out of the schoolroom, but more than one Latin lesson was interrupted by a spaniel on a sugar rush or a parrot reciting forbidden rhymes. Not all pet stories were happy ones. Castles were dangerous for small creatures. Window ledges, open fires, and mysterious palace accidents claimed many a kitten or songbird. But for every tragic tale, there were moments of delight. A puppy snoring beside a frightened prince during a thunderstorm, a canary's song echoing down a marble hall, or a horse that knew just when to nuzzle away a royal sulk. So as you drift into sleep, think of the pets who brought mischief and solace to royal nurseries: the spaniels, parrots, monkeys, and yes, the occasional emotional support deer. They were companions in loneliness, allies against boredom, and the least complicated relationships you'd ever have. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with loyal animals and laughter that doesn't care about bloodlines. Royal children were taught languages, music, and history. But nobody ever explained why the family doctor had a fainting couch, or why portraits of grandma were quietly taken down after she started growing sideburns. Let's join you in a palace classroom, actually, a grand chamber with more books than most villages, the air smelling faintly of ink, old leather, and nervous ambition. As a royal child, your life is an endless schedule of lessons delivered by an army of tutors and governesses. Each one is an expert in their field, and all are painfully aware that their true job is to shape you into a living symbol of dynastic hope. Preferably one who can recite Latin, play the harpsichord, and survive a formal dinner without tipping over. The academic day begins early. Your governess enters with military precision, fluffing your pillows, correcting your posture, and reviewing your progress. She's equal parts second mother and drill sergeant, skilled at smuggling vegetables into your breakfast and enforcing etiquette with the flick of a lace handkerchief. The first lesson is usually a language: French, Spanish, or German, depending on which cousin you're expected to marry. Every mispronounced word earns a look that could curdle cream. Next, a parade of tutors arrives, each with their own quirks. The mathematician with chalk-stained cuffs, the music master who weeps at the wrong note, and the historian who recites family scandals as if they're object lessons. But underneath all the grammar and scales lurks a silent tension. Inbred royal children are often delicate, both physically and emotionally. The adults notice every wince, stammer, and skipped heartbeat, even if they pretend not to. A tremor in your hand or a sudden nosebleed might prompt the arrival of the family doctor, who always seems slightly terrified of what he'll find. Tutors have been quietly warned to avoid certain topics. Don't mention the jaw. Don't discuss left-handedness. And please don't ask why all the family portraits look like they were painted from the same model. Despite the pressure, there's room for small rebellions. A clever child learns to charm their way out of arithmetic, to distract a tutor with questions about ancient Rome, or to win extra dessert by performing a flawless minuet. Gossip, whispered in the corridors, is a favorite subject, especially stories about eccentric ancestors, embarrassing marriage proposals, or the mysterious fate of Uncle Ferdinand's collection of wigs. Learning is serious business, but it's never entirely free from royal absurdity. Of course, all this education serves a purpose. Royal children are trained to rule, to read treaties, sign decrees, and smile serenely while their relatives argue about inheritance rights. By the age of 10, you've memorized the family tree, all 12 tangled generations, perfected your bow, and learned to say, "I'm delighted" in 5 languages, even when you're not. Every lesson is a rehearsal for future responsibilities, but also a way to manage the fragile egos and unpredictable health of the royal household. Yet, for all their grandeur, these palace classrooms are safe havens, a place where you can, occasionally, just be a child. There are secret jokes with governesses, songs sung badly on purpose, and moments of quiet understanding when a tutor turns a blind eye to your fidgeting. So tonight, as you drift off, remember that behind every brilliant royal was a cast of tutors, governesses, and discreetly terrified physicians, all united by one silent code: teach the child everything, but never, ever mention the jaw. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with gentle teachers and lessons where it's okay to be a little bit yourself. Despite all the privilege, many royal children never made it to adulthood. The combination of fragile health, inbreeding, and medieval medicine meant that a royal nursery was also a waiting room for tragedy. Let's begin at dusk, in a palace nursery, candles flickering against the darkening windows. You, a royal child, are tucked into a bed piled high with embroidered pillows and silk sheets, surrounded by worried nurses and the faint scent of lavender. The atmosphere is peaceful, but underneath, everyone is tense. Because in this world, every cough is a warning, every fever a crisis, and every quiet night a small miracle. There are no guarantees here, not even for the children of kings. Royal nurseries, for all their glittering toys and golden rattles, were haunted by a silent fear: death. Child mortality rates were high everywhere in medieval and early modern Europe, but in the palaces it came with a special sting. Your every breath was documented, your meals measured, and your daily progress scrutinized by tutors, doctors, and sometimes even astrologers, hoping for a sign that you would survive to adulthood. Parents and courtiers watched anxiously for any symptom that could signal the beginning of the end. A royal child's immune system wasn't helped by all those repeated surnames on the family tree. Inbreeding, intended to preserve pure bloodlines, sometimes handed down genetic disorders that made even minor illnesses into major threats. Hemophilia, epilepsy, and all manner of mystery syndromes lurked behind the palace walls. A simple cut could become a catastrophe. A lingering cough might lead to whispered prayers and rushed letters to foreign specialists. And then there was the medicine, if you could call it that. The best doctors money could buy arrived with jars of leeches, bottles of questionable tinctures, and theories about balancing your humors that would make a modern nurse faint. The treatments were often as dangerous as the diseases. Bloodletting, purges, and experimental herbal concoctions were common. If you survived an illness, it was as much luck as skill, and everyone credited the nearest relic or a helpful saint. For those who didn't make it, the palace's sorrow was wrapped in ceremony. Small coffins, draped in velvet, were carried quietly through hidden corridors. Sometimes, official records didn't even list a name. just the little prince or the infanta. Portraits were commissioned posthumously, showing glowing cheeks and peaceful smiles, a hopeful vision that rarely matched the real ending. Grief was a private luxury for royal parents. Publicly, the business of dynasties continued, and another nursery was prepared for the next heir. Yet, in the middle of all this tragedy, royal children found moments of happiness. There were secret games behind heavy curtains, stolen sweets from the kitchens, and friendships formed with siblings or even favorite pets. The laughter, when it came, was bright and fierce, a small rebellion against the odds. Governesses and nurses did their best to shield their charges, weaving stories of distant lands and brave ancestors, trying to make the world feel safe, if only for a moment. So, as you lie in your own bed tonight, remember that royal children faced uncertainty, just as real as any peasant, perhaps even more so, because everyone was watching. Every healthy birthday was a triumph, every illness a national concern, and every quiet night a blessing counted in whispers. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with ordinary joys, simple comforts, and the unspoken hope for another dawn. When things got really weird, royals didn't blame the gene pool. Instead, they invented legends, saints, or family curses to explain why the king's left eye wandered off during meetings. Superstition was the original public relations strategy. Let's set the scene. You're a royal child with a jaw that could open walnuts and a cousin who faints at the smell of cabbage. Word gets around the palace, courtiers start to whisper, and the servants are passing stories faster than the plague. In an age before DNA, science, or even honest mirrors, a curious collection of tales soon blossoms in the echoing marble halls. No one wants to admit that 3 generations of cousin marriage have caused half the royal nursery to be allergic to daylight. Instead, mysterious forces are blamed, and the more creative the explanation, the better. It's not just the peasants who believe these stories. Kings, queens, and their doctors are often first in line to spread a good legend. Maybe your family's night blindness is really the sign of a secret pact with a local saint, or your brother's uncontrollable sneezing is the result of an ancient curse placed by a rival dynasty, a sudden rash of royal madness, clearly the work of a mischievous fairy, a vengeful ancestor, or the astrological calamity of Mars being in the wrong house. In the palace, logic is optional, narrative is everything. These legends were more than idle gossip, they were tools. A well-timed story could protect a dynasty from political embarrassment. If a prince was sickly or slow to speak, it was easier to say he'd been chosen for a spiritual test than to admit that Uncle Ferdinand and Aunt Maria should never have been allowed near a marriage contract. Some royal families went so far as to invent entire miracles. Was the princess born with a limp? Rebrand it as the mark of the chosen, proof that God had a special plan for her. Sometimes, these stories grew so large they became part of the official record. Medieval scribes dutifully wrote down every omen, dream, or celestial sign. A passing comet became an explanation for a string of family tragedies. A 3-legged toad hopping across the palace garden was a harbinger of good luck or certain doom, depending on who was telling the story. Royal biographers spun family problems into glorious epics. The king's tendency to sleep through important meetings? He's in deep communion with the angels. Of course, these legends weren't always harmless. A rumor about a witch's curse could start a panic, send servants fleeing, or even spark a real-life witch hunt. Bad harvest? Blame the queen's odd cough. Baby born with a birthmark? Clearly the sign of royal destiny, or an ancient wrong finally coming due. For every medical mystery, there was an army of story spinners, eager to explain it with anything except genetics. Even portraits played a part in myth-making. Artists painted out physical oddities, smoothed over lopsided features, and occasionally added a halo or two. The more dramatic the story, the better. By the time the official version reached the people, a family curse was a badge of honor, not a genetic liability. So as you close your eyes tonight, Be thankful your family doesn't need a team of bards to explain why you sunburn easily or can't eat peanuts. Royal history is a tapestry woven from facts and fiction, and sometimes the legends lasted longer than the bloodlines themselves. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of curses, fairies, and family secrets no one wants to explain. Sometimes, after decades of genetic roulette, a royal family would marry outside the usual cousin circle and nothing changed. The inbreeding was so entrenched that a single new branch on the family tree couldn't save anyone. Picture yourself as the latest royal experiment in fresh genetics. The entire court is abuzz because, scandal of scandals, your parents have imported a spouse from a far-off land, someone whose family isn't even on the second page of the official genealogy. Tutors whisper that this could be the moment the family's fortunes turn around. Physicians are excited. The palace portrait painter quietly sketches a nose that doesn't match the usual family prototype, just in case. But real life doesn't always follow the optimistic script. After generations of close relative marriages, the royal gene pool is more like a puddle, and one infusion of outsider blood doesn't perform miracles overnight. Sometimes, the new bride or groom turns out to have their own hereditary quirks, unexpected allergies, a suspicious fondness for fainting, or a family history of wild temperaments. The gamble rarely pays off in the way everyone hopes. In some unlucky dynasties, the fresh spouse actually comes from another noble line that's been doing its own version of close-quarters matchmaking for centuries. Royal bloodlines are more interconnected than palace wine cellars, so the happy couple has children. And the old hopes flare up. Will these new heirs be sturdier, taller, and less distinctive? Maybe. Or maybe the latest baby arrives with the family chin, the family cough, and a brand new rash that has the court physician rewriting his medical notes. It turns out that decades of inbreeding don't untangle themselves with one brave marital decision. Genetics, as every palace apothecary learns, has a long memory and a wicked sense of humor. Still, royal marriages to outsiders were often hailed as political and medical turning points. There was always a flurry of optimism, new treaties, new dowries, and new recipes imported for the palace kitchens. Sometimes the people even celebrated, hoping that the next prince or princess would look a little less like all the previous portraits. But hope doesn't always change reality. The stubborn family traits linger. The infamous Habsburg jaw or Bourbon nose might skip a generation, but they don't pack up and leave just because someone married a princess from Denmark or a Grand Duke from Poland. The disappointment was sometimes quietly epic. After years of anticipation, a royal baby would be presented at court, only for the assembled crowd to murmur, "Looks just like Uncle Charles." Even the most ambitious queen couldn't erase generations of cuisine matching with a single bold marriage. Palaces filled with new languages and customs, but the family quirks stayed stubbornly put. Some royal mothers went so far as to trace the outsider spouse's family tree, only to discover that 6 branches back, there was another alarming connection to the old crowd. Europe's nobility had been trading cousins for so long that true genetic escape was almost impossible. Still, these attempts at new blood were better than nothing. Sometimes, after a few more generations, the gene pool did widen a little, and some children emerged without the most famous family features. And if nothing else, marrying outside the family was a statement, a signal to the world that maybe, just maybe, the age of the family shrub was coming to an end. So, as you drift off tonight, remember, sometimes even the boldest royal marriage is just another shuffle of the same old deck. If your family's faces don't all match, be grateful for the odd miracle of genetic diversity. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with new beginnings that actually make a difference. Everyone loves palace gossip. And when your royal child starts acting oddly or growing an extra thumb, rumors spread like wildfire. In the age before Instagram, peasant gossip was the original tabloid. Let's take a stroll through a bustling medieval marketplace. The smell of fresh bread, manure, and fish mingles in the air. But today there's a new aroma, a whiff of scandal straight from the palace gates. Over by the well, the baker's wife is telling anyone who'll listen that the new little prince is as pale as goat's milk and twice as jumpy. Meanwhile, the blacksmith insists that the king's youngest daughter has hair so thick it needs its own lady in waiting. Stories swirl through the town like autumn leaves in a gale. For royal children, every sneeze, stumble, or mysterious birthmark became public property. With no newspapers, people relied on word of mouth, and each retelling made the tale more entertaining. Perhaps the young duke was spotted limping through the gardens, or a maid claimed the princess's eyes glowed in the dark. By the time these stories travelled from the palace to the pigsty, the royal nursery had become a circus of marvels and monsters. It wasn't just the peasants who speculated. The nobility and court insiders had their own grapevine, eager to dissect every hiccup and fainting spell. Foreign ambassadors kept notes, ready to update their kings and queens about any royal misstep that could be turned to political advantage. Rumours travelled across borders almost as quickly as the royal matchmakers themselves, and the juicier the gossip, the more likely it was to end up embroidered into history. Sometimes the palace tried to squash the chatter. Public appearances were orchestrated with military precision, children dressed in their finest, arranged for maximum adorability, with nannies lurking just out of sight, ready to whisk away any heir who showed signs of a suspicious rash. Painters retouched portraits, poets praised virtues, and priests blessed the children from a safe, rumor-proof distance. But real life had a way of leaking out. If a royal child vanished from public view, people guessed the worst: illness, madness, or some new family curse. Gossip wasn't always mean-spirited. Sometimes it was hopeful or even affectionate. Peasants imagined the royals as both magical and oddly familiar, wrestling with problems and rashes, just like everyone else, albeit with fancier pajamas and more servants. For every outlandish rumor about webbed feet or glowing eyes, there were whispers of royal kindness, a prince who smiled at a street urchin, a princess who fed the palace cats. The line between awe and mockery was thin, but the royal family's troubles gave everyone something to talk about at the tavern. Still, the stakes could be high. In times of unrest, palace rumors could spark riots or feed conspiracy theories. A single story about a sickly heir or an unnatural birth could throw succession plans into chaos, or embolden rival factions to plot rebellion. The palace's reputation rested not just on reality, but on controlling the narrative, an endless, losing battle against the collective imagination of the people. So, as you snuggle up tonight, think of the countless stories whispered over fences and at market stalls, each one twisting the truth just a little. The royals may have lived behind stone walls, but their secrets never stayed hidden for long. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of rumors, unless, of course, you dream of being just a little bit famous. Every once in a while, a rebellious prince or princess would marry someone not related to them, an actual outsider. The shockwaves would rattle every chandelier in Europe. But sometimes, just sometimes, the children turned out a little less memorable. Let's set the stage. You're a royal heir, raised on a steady diet of etiquette, genealogy charts, and the quiet expectation that your spouse will, at most, be your second cousin. Life is predictable, right down to your future wedding guest list. Then one day, you do the unthinkable. You fall in love with someone who doesn't show up on the family tree. A dashing soldier, a clever merchant's daughter, maybe even a foreign noble who isn't, for once, also your uncle's niece. The palace erupts. Courtiers faint into their ruffled sleeves. Your mother clutches her pearls. The royal matchmakers panic, feverishly redrawing family charts and writing urgent letters to distant relatives for approval. Outside, the peasantry whispers, some scandalized, some secretly rooting for you. Even the court painter waits nervously. wondering whether the new spouse's nose will finally break the family mold. Marrying an outsider was more than a romantic rebellion. It was a declaration of independence from generations of cousin matching. Sometimes, these unions were born of true love. More often, they were political gambits or acts of royal desperation. Kings looking to end dynastic feuds, queens hoping to import new alliances, or spare princes, simply tired of seeing the same faces at every ball. But no matter the reason, these marriages shook the palace to its foundations. The early days were never easy. Outsider spouses had to navigate a maze of traditions, backstairs intrigue, and in-laws who viewed them with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Every misstep, a missed curtsy, a wrong fork at dinner was scrutinized. But sometimes, the gamble paid off. Children born of these unions were watched even more closely than usual, their health, appearance, and personalities tracked as if the future of the kingdom depended on whether they inherited Aunt Augusta's unfortunate chin. And sometimes, just sometimes, the results were striking. A prince with a jawline that could actually close. A princess who didn't faint at the sight of a carrot. Children who grew up looking and behaving a little less like their relatives and a little more like, well, normal people. Gossip flowed. Was it the new blood? Or just a lucky roll of the genetic dice? Maybe the universe was rewarding a little royal courage, but the cycle was hard to break completely. Even after a generation or two of fresh marriages, the temptation to return to the old ways lingered. Alliances were still forged over cousinly handshakes, and many dynasties slipped back into the comfortable pattern of arranged family unions. Still, every rebel marriage proved that history could be rewritten, at least for a while. For those bold royals, life was never boring. They brought new energy, new customs, and the hope that the next chapter might look a little different from the last. The palace portraits started to show some variety. Courtiers practiced new greetings, and the chroniclers sharpened their pens to record tales of romance, scandal, and, sometimes, genuine happiness. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember the few royals who dared to rewrite their fate, one marriage at a time. Change is always possible, even in the most stubborn family trees. May your dreams be filled with bold choices, fresh faces, and the courage to love outside the box. So, what did all this inbreeding actually achieve? A line of kings who couldn't chew their food, queens who swooned at sunlight, and a collection of stories that will make you grateful your parents met at a party and not a family reunion. Let's step back for a moment, out of the palaces and family portraits, and take a deep breath of fresh, genetically diverse air. The royal houses of Europe spent centuries tying themselves in knots, all for the sake of keeping thrones, lands, and fortunes neatly packaged within the family. The result? Dynasties that could boast an uninterrupted line from the ancient past, if not always a healthy one. The great European royal experiment gave us a crash course in the limits of genetics and the world's longest-running episode of what could possibly go wrong. What you end up with is not just a parade of memorable chins and unique medical charts, but an entire culture shaped by its own anxieties. Royalty learned to spin their quirks into legends, hide their troubles behind lace collars, and host weddings where half the guests were also on the guest list for last year's christening. Family trees started to look more like family wreaths, and portrait galleries became games of spot, the difference where the answer was usually there isn't one. But there were lessons buried in the mess. First, that power, even when wrapped in silk, can come with unexpected side effects. The pursuit of pure bloodlines led to the opposite. Fragile children, sudden crises, and thrones lost not to invasion, but to complications at dinner. Royals tried everything to control fate: astrology, arranged marriages, prayers, and enough doctors to form a small parade. But the gene pool had its own plans, and sometimes, even the grandest dynasties were humbled by a single stubborn allele. Then there's the laughter. Because if you can't laugh at the world's most exclusive matchmaking service producing a line of monarchs who couldn't ride a horse without supervision, what can you do? Jokes and rumors swirled through palaces and peasant cottages alike. Court jesters had a field day. Poets composed satirical verses, and painters quietly improved their royal subjects with every brushstroke. The oddities became folklore. The king who talked to his fruit bowl, the princess who fainted at the sound of bagpipes, the prince whose family tree was so tangled even he couldn't find his place in it, and of course, the warning. If you take away anything from the centuries-long royal experiment, let it be this. Don't try this at home. Marrying your cousin might have seemed like a good way to keep the castle. But these days, we have more options and, mercifully, a greater appreciation for the benefits of genetic variety. Modern royals, for all their scandals, have mostly retired the tradition of treating marriage like a diplomatic family picnic. Love, compatibility, and maybe a nice sense of humor now rank higher than shared great-grandparents. So as you close your eyes tonight, grateful for your ordinary last name and your unremarkable jawline, remember that history's most powerful families gave us more than palaces and parades. They gave us a reason to appreciate a little distance in the family tree. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with laughter, lessons, and plenty of genetic surprise. Being born into royalty meant winning life's inheritance lottery, or so people thought. In reality, you had about a 50-50 shot of inheriting either a throne or a set of genetic quirks so advanced your family crest should have included a warning label. Every new baby was like opening a surprise egg. Sometimes you got an heir. Sometimes you got an entire medical case study. Let's imagine the anticipation. The court gathers in the palace nursery. A swirl of lace, powdered wigs, and hushed speculation. The air smells of lavender, candle wax, and anxious hope. A royal nurse steps forward to present the latest addition to the dynasty. Everyone leans in, squinting for a first glimpse at the jawline. Is it majestic? Is it alarming? Grandmothers silently compare notes with a glance. The family physician takes out his notebook, already prepared to document whatever genetic surprise is about to be revealed. Being a royal baby was less about rattles and more about roulette. A healthy, strapping boy with all the right features? Perfect. The kingdom breathes a sigh of relief and starts planning elaborate ceremonies. But if the baby has inherited the chin, or perhaps a tendency to faint at the scent of soup, things get more complicated. In some dynasties, heirs were scrutinized so intensely that every sneeze became a minor political event. Did the infant's eyes cross for a moment? Was that an early sign of genius, or a new footnote in the annals of royal peculiarities? In reality, the royal inheritance wasn't just about property, crowns, or castles. It was also a high-stakes game of DNA bingo. The trouble was, the family prize pool was a little repetitive. If Uncle Leopold had a tendency to collect rare allergies and Aunt Maria had a penchant for spontaneous nosebleeds, the odds were that someone in the next generation was about to combine the lot. Sometimes the results were almost comically unfortunate. Imagine growing up surrounded by siblings and cousins who each showcased a different, increasingly rare family trait. One with a double crown, another with webbed toes, and a third with a laugh that echoed down the family line like a medieval alarm bell. The stakes were high. The entire kingdom waited to see if the new royal baby would one day rule, or at least make it through dinner without a medical emergency. Court gossip thrived on predictions. Would the prince inherit his mother's iron constitution, or his father's unfortunate inability to digest bread? Even royal painters played along, quietly smoothing out the odd feature or exaggerating the right nose, hoping to keep up appearances for posterity. But for every unlucky draw, there were heirs who seemed to emerge unscathed. Children who were robust, charming, and managed to survive both chickenpox and childhood tutors. These miracle heirs became legends in their own right. the rare proof that sometimes, against all odds, the inheritance lottery paid off with a winning ticket. Their portraits adorned palace walls, celebrated not just for future rulership, but for the small miracle of genetic luck. So, tonight, as you settle into bed, think about your own family inheritance. Maybe you got your father's nose or your grandmother's sense of humor. But at least you didn't have to debut your baby teeth to an anxious room full of dukes and duchesses. In the royal lottery, every child was a gamble. Sometimes you won a crown, sometimes you won a chin. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the kind of surprises you'd actually want to inherit. Imagine trying to paint or photograph a royal wedding where the bride, the groom, and half the guests all share the same chin. The royal wedding album wasn't just a celebration of love. It was a game of spot, the difference that nobody ever won. Generations later, historians would squint at portraits and wonder if the artist just gave up and started painting potatoes. Let's step into the most anticipated day in any royal calendar, the wedding. The bells are ringing, carriages are lining up, and the palace is filled with anxious excitement. The bride is wearing a dress that weighs more than some farm animals. The groom is polished to a blinding shine, and the guests are dazzling in their finest brocades. The only trouble? When the painter or photographer steps back for the official portrait, the royal family lines up, and the view becomes strangely repetitive. Here comes the wedding artist, sweating under his wig, trying desperately to capture each person's unique features. But it's not easy when the royal jawline is as common as the family crest. Every time he glances up, it's like déjà vu. The maid of honor could easily be swapped with the best man, and the flower girl's nose is a perfect match for the archbishop's. In the crowd, uncles and cousins blend together, their faces forming a seamless parade of inherited quirks. You can practically hear the painter muttering, "If you've seen one Habsburg, you've seen them all." The artist's struggle becomes the family's joke. Courtiers whisper about the attack of the clones, while aunts and grandmothers try to arrange everyone to show off the good side, which, unfortunately, is the same side for everyone. The bride and groom exchange nervous glances as they realize their smiles are mirror images, and the page boys are already plotting to swap places for the formal portrait, confident no one will notice. But it isn't just the artist who suffers. Imagine being a guest, searching for your seat at the banquet, only to discover that you're surrounded by copies of yourself, cousins, siblings, in-laws, all with eerily familiar expressions. Conversation turns into a comedy of confusion. Did you see Charles dancing with Marie? Which Charles? Which Marie? Name tags become essential, and the wedding planner gives up trying to remember who's related to whom. The resulting artwork or photograph is a masterpiece of accidental surrealism. Every row is packed with matching noses and identical jawlines. When the image is unveiled for the court, everyone applauds politely, secretly hoping they can find themselves in the sea of sameness. Generations later, historians dig through the archives, trying to untangle who's who and occasionally wondering if some relatives were painted in twice just to fill space. Behind the laughter, though, there's a touch of melancholy. These portraits were meant to commemorate joy and continuity, but they also reveal the cost of centuries of family-first matchmaking. The sameness becomes a kind of silent legacy, a reminder that, for all the ceremony and splendor, the royal world could be claustrophobically small. So, as you close your eyes tonight, be thankful your own wedding album isn't a riddle. Diversity is a gift, one the royal families learned the hard way. Sleep well, and may your dreams feature celebration, variety, and the joy of seeing more than one face at the party. When your doctor says maybe avoid strenuous activity and your relatives frown at fresh air, you find creative hobbies like breeding pigeons, inventing new board games, or writing dramatic poetry about your own reflection. Royal children, confined by health and custom, sometimes invented pastimes that only made sense if you were the world's most delicate snowflake with unlimited free time. Let's settle into a long, drafty corridor deep inside a European palace. Outside, the peasants are working in fields and markets, but you, as a royal child, are forbidden from anything that might involve mud, germs, or sudden movements. You've got hours to fill and limited options. Climbing trees? Out of the question. Hide and seek in the gardens? Only if you promise not to run, jump, or, heaven forbid, perspire. So you retreat to your private quarters and get creative. Some royal hobbies were surprisingly practical. Breeding lapdogs or fancy pigeons became an obsession for more than one bored prince or princess. The palace rooftops sometimes teemed with rare birds, each with its own silly name and handwritten genealogy more carefully tracked than the humankind. A few royals turned their hand to collecting oddities. Seashells from distant coasts, miniature mechanical automata, or rocks that looked like important ancestors. Cabinets of curiosity lined the palace walls, filled with feathers, fossils, and whatever the latest royal tutor declared educational. For those with a flair for the dramatic, poetry and theatre were favoured pastimes. It wasn't unusual for a lonely young duchess to spend afternoons composing tragic sonnets about unrequited love, usually with herself as both hero and heroine, or for a nervous prince to organise shadow puppet plays for his younger siblings. Some ambitious children even wrote their own plays, full of long, heartfelt speeches and suspiciously familiar family characters, though the courtier audience was expected to clap, no matter how many times the noble king with the peculiar jaw made an appearance. Game invention was another royal specialty. With so many hours indoors, chess and backgammon weren't enough. Royals tinkered with new rules, elaborate scoring systems, and often invented games that nobody else understood. Especially when the winner was always meant to be the host. It was not uncommon for a visiting ambassador to lose at Royal Gooseball or Princess's Puzzle and be forced to pretend the rules made any sense at all. Then there were the artistic pursuits, sketching self-portraits or exaggerated caricatures of relatives, designing elaborate embroidery or painting flowers from the safety of the sunroom. Music was encouraged, provided it didn't require vigorous movement. Flutes, harpsichords, and gentle singing were in. Drumming was usually forbidden on account of delicate nerves and easily startled lapdogs. All this might sound charming, but behind it was the real reason for the palace pastime explosion: caution. With fragile health, unpredictable family traits, and a genuine fear of catching cold, royal children were denied the freedoms of ordinary life. Instead, their hobbies became the only safe outlets for curiosity, restlessness, and a bit of fun. So as you drift off tonight, remember the strange joys of having too much time and too many restrictions. The world's most privileged children spent their days breeding rare pigeons and writing poetry about their own reflections. Proof that boredom is a powerful force for creativity, especially when your biggest risk is a paper cut. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with laughter, colour, and hobbies you choose for yourself. If you thought your family doctor was thorough, try having an entire committee of nervous physicians who all disagree. One suggests more mercury, another recommends leeches, and the French guy just mutters about humours while holding a live chicken. For royal kids, every sniffle launched a medical debate worthy of a town council. Let's open the door to your royal sick room. You're lying beneath a mountain of embroidered quilts, clutching a feverish toy, while a parade of court physicians lines up at the foot of your bed. The air is thick with the scent of herbs, burning incense, and a strong undercurrent of panic. The head doctor, resplendent in velvet robes, whispers with his colleagues, each certain he alone holds the cure for whatever strange ailment you've inherited. Every major court had its own cast of medical experts: Spanish surgeons, Italian apothecaries, German bone setters, and French physicians who insisted that all illnesses originated from your melancholy spleen. The king and queen summoned them all, hoping that at least one would find a remedy that didn't involve sacrificing the family's favorite goat. Sometimes the physicians agreed, usually on the need for further consultation. The diagnosis process was a spectacle in itself. First, the patient, that's you, was poked, prodded, and occasionally sniffed by a succession of experts, each with their own preferred diagnostic tools. One waved a silver pendulum above your head, another pressed your feet, checking for royal swelling. A third might ask you to recite poetry backward to prove you hadn't been hexed by a rival court. Once all the examinations were done, the real show began. The physicians' council gathered in the corner. They argued in Latin, French, or a mix of both, scribbling notes and comparing horoscopes. The Italian recommended olive oil, the Englishman argued for bloodletting, and the German always thought more beer would help. The debate could last for hours, with each new symptom prompting another flurry of disagreement. In the end, the treatment was often a mashup of everyone's ideas, a little leeching here, a touch of mint tea there, maybe a midnight prayer session for good measure. No wonder royal children were nervous every time they sneezed. One cough could lead to a week in bed, 6 different tonics, and a strong chance of having your hair set on fire by accident, for purification, of course. For the unlucky, the parade of physicians returned day after day, monitoring progress and suggesting increasingly bizarre remedies. Powdered emerald, warm pigeon soup, or a hat full of herbs to balance your energies. It didn't help that the court physicians were as competitive as tournament knights. Each was eager to win royal favor, and failure could mean banishment, or worse, being reassigned to the kitchens. That's why your medical chart read like a recipe book with too many chefs, a pinch of astrology, a dash of superstition, and a generous helping of guesswork. For all the chaos, there was something almost comforting about the parade of experts. At least you were never alone. The palace was always buzzing with new arrivals, fresh opinions, and the hope that maybe this time someone would get it right. Occasionally, a treatment worked, and the lucky physician basked in glory until the next fever hit and the cycle began anew. So as you drift off, grateful for your quiet doctor's office and evidence-based medicine, remember the royal kids who faced every cold with a medical team straight out of a slapstick play. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of Latin diagnoses, feathered hats, and suspiciously aromatic cures. Every royal family had that one painting, the one so unflattering, so brutally honest, that it started rumors, reforms, or, in some cases, desperate attempts to find new spouses outside the usual cousin pool. Sometimes, all it took was a single portrait unveiling to convince a dynasty it was time to import some fresh genetics. Stat. Let's set the scene. The grand hall is crowded, sunlight glinting off gold frames and polished marble floors. The entire royal family gathers for the unveiling of a long-awaited masterpiece. An official portrait meant to immortalize the family's splendor for generations. Courtiers and ambassadors line the room, eager for a glimpse. The painter, a little too pale and nervous, waits beside the shrouded canvas, aware that he's either about to earn a fortune or be quietly sent to paint poultry for the rest of his career. The moment arrives. The silk is swept aside. There they are. The king, queen, princes, princesses, all posed in their finery. But something's off. The royal jawlines jut at improbable angles. The ears look suspiciously uniform. There's a collective silence as everyone stares, then glances around to see who will speak first. The family resemblance is not just strong, it's overwhelming. You could use the painting as a study in recessive genes, or as a warning for future generations. Whispers spread like wildfire. Courtiers nudge each other, speculating about the artist's motives. Was he cruel, honest, or just exhausted by trying to invent new ways to disguise the same faces? The queen's cousin looks away in embarrassment. The king's mother coughs into her handkerchief. Some family members start to worry, quietly of course, about what this painting might reveal to potential marriage partners across Europe. No amount of brocade or jewels can distract from the unnerving symmetry. The portrait takes on a life of its own. Rumors ripple through the palace, then out into the city, then all the way to rival courts. Is the royal line cursed? Are they hiding some scandalous medical condition? The family portrait, intended as a mark of pride, becomes the butt of jokes, the centerpiece of satirical poems, and, most importantly, the catalyst for anxious royal advisors to suggest broadening the search for marriage candidates. Sometimes, these reactions spurred genuine change. After one particularly memorable portrait left a dynasty's marriage prospects in tatters, foreign princesses were suddenly back in fashion. New blood brought hope and a little relief for court artists. In other cases, the lesson was ignored, and the family trees grew ever more circular. But the painting itself became a silent protest, hanging on the wall as a reminder of what happens when tradition gets a little too cozy. For the artist, the aftermath could be dramatic. Some painters vanished from the palace, hired by families who preferred their flaws less documented. Others became infamous, their names spoken in whispers at royal gatherings. And every court artist after took careful notes. Always paint with a gentle hand, and maybe invent a tasteful shadow for that particularly prominent chin. So as you close your eyes tonight, picture the family photos on your own wall. Maybe they aren't perfect, but they're honest. And, hopefully, nobody's using them as a cautionary tale for the entire neighborhood. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with variety, fresh faces, and portraits you can look at without starting a royal crisis. So tonight, as you settle into your clean bed, maybe with a glass of water that won't give you scurvy and a pillow that isn't embroidered with your own family crest, take a quiet moment to be grateful for modern love, modern medicine, and a gene pool with more than 3 options. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that being born royal didn't guarantee you a fairy tale life. It often meant being the main character in a real-life episode of How Did We Survive This Long? Royal children battled more than politics and etiquette. They survived hereditary hiccups, medical experiments, and family gatherings that could double as class reunions. Through all the jawlines, tragic destinies, and awkward portraits, they endured, with varying degrees of success and some genuinely unforgettable chins. Let's honor their resilience, their accidental comedy, and the weird determination that kept kingdoms limping along, generation after generation. It's a testament to human stubbornness, optimism, and the ability to laugh through even the most awkward family trees. So, as you drift off tonight, remember, you don't need a crown, a castle, or a title to be extraordinary. Just a warm blanket, a sense of humor, and maybe the good fortune of not sharing too much DNA with your neighbors. History is strange, survival is stranger, and you, wrapped up in your peaceful modern bed, are proof that humanity always finds a way through, even if it has to do it with a sideways smile. Good night. Sleep well, and if you dream of castles, may everyone in them look just a little bit different from you.